Okay, so welcome to the webinar, everybody. Everybody's in silent mode, and so as we're going through the webinar, if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A panel on your Zoom screen. You can also put them in on Facebook. We've got a couple people monitoring Facebook, and they'll relay your questions to us. So we'll hold Q&A until the end, and we will have time for discussion and questions afterwards. Okay, you're seeing the presenter mode. Let me swap displays then. Thank you. How about now? Does that work? Are you seeing the slide now? Perfect. Okay, great. All right. So welcome, everybody. We're really happy to have you at this webinar. We're thrilled to have David Sibley with us today. We'll be getting started with the webinar in just a second. I have a few quick announcements to make. So first of all, for those of you that might not be familiar with Birds Caribbean, we're a regional nonprofit. We're dedicated to conserving birds and their habitat throughout all the islands of the Caribbean. And our mission is to raise awareness, promote sound science, and empower local partners to build a region where people appreciate and conserve and benefit from thriving bird populations and ecosystems. And we're a 33-year-old organization. We've got a lot of fantastic people that we work with throughout all the islands of the Caribbean and beyond: researchers, government agencies, NGOs, artists, photographers, teachers, tour guides, and so forth. So we work with everybody to conserve the region's birds. Right. And ongoing right now is our Caribbean Endemic Bird Festival. And this is a festival that we celebrate every spring. And our theme this year is Sing, Fly, Soar Like a Bird. And so all throughout April and May, we are celebrating with this theme, and we have an endemic bird of the day every day. We have a fantastic artist who is creating illustrations for us. And so with our endemic bird of the day, there's a coloring page, there's puzzles, there's activity sheets, bird calls, videos, and so forth. So you can learn about a new endemic bird in the Caribbean. And in this festival, we're celebrating the fact that there's 171 endemics in the Caribbean, which is really incredible. And so we celebrated with 50 species last year. We've got 30 new species this year. And so we invite you to follow along with us and learn about a new endemic bird on social media and our website. And as part of our Endemic Bird Festival, we also have weekly webinars. So this is one that's happening today. And we've got a couple other really exciting ones coming up as well. Next week, we've got Dr. Kevin Omland and his students and some of his colleagues at the Bahamas National Trust. He'll be talking about the critically endangered Bahama oriole, and he'll be giving us an update on all the latest research and the conservation status of this species. So do please register and join us. I'll add the chat links, the links to register in the chat in a few minutes. But also, if you follow us on our social media or website, you'll be able to register from there as well. Another really exciting webinar the week after that is Anne Maddock, who is a hummingbird photographer. And so she just published this gorgeous new book called Flying Jewels. And so she's going to talk to us about endemic hummingbirds of the Caribbean, especially. And so she has a really, really great webinar planned for us. And so I hope you'll join us on May 27th for that. All right, and then here's just a little bit more with our contact information. You can sign up to get our monthly newsletter. We would love for you to become a member. Oh, and Anne's on the webinar. That's great. Join our listserv, follow us on social media, and just keep up with all our news. We would love to have more of you following us and joining us on all of our different activities and contributing as well. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. So without further ado, let's get going on the webinar. And we're thrilled to have with us today David Sibley. David Allen Sibley is the son of Yale University ornithologist Fred Sibley. David began birding in his childhood. He got his start as a bird watcher in Cape May Point, New Jersey. and in 1980 after dropping out of college. So he's largely a self-taught bird illustrator. He was inspired to pursue creating his own illustrated field guide after leading tours in the 1980s and 1990s, and finding that existing field guides did not generally illustrate or describe alternate or juvenile plumages of birds. In 2002, he received the Roger Torrey Peterson Award from the American Birding Association for lifetime achievement in promoting the cause of birding. And in 2006, he was awarded the Linnaean Society of New York's Eisenman Medal. He is the author of numerous books, including the famous field guides, Sibley Guide to Birds and the Sibley Guide to Trees, and many other books. He's coming to us today from Gull Island off Long Island, New York, a tiny island just 7 or 8 acres in size. And he told me earlier today that it has thousands of common terns and roseate terns coming back to nest. And he and his wife, Joan, who's an ornithologist, are there right now to check on the birds and get ready for an upcoming field season of research. And so welcome, David. We're so excited to have you, honored to have you presenting with us today. And I will stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really happy to be able to support Birds Caribbean by doing this program today, and I'm proud to be a supporter the rest of the year as well. I really think they're doing great work, and I've always been fascinated by the Caribbean, the birds, the islands, the endemics. It's just such a fascinating region. I was just telling Lisa before the webinar started that The Birds of the West Indies by James Bond was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. When I was in 3rd grade, I remember taking that book, actually sneaking the book into church and flipping through the pages, looking at the illustrations by Earl Poole and the paintings by Don Eccleberry, and just daydreaming about all these exotic birds in the Caribbean. And now I've been fortunate to be able to go to a couple of islands and see some of them, but would love to see more. So I've put together a talk today about bird flight, all aspects of bird flight. And since everything birds do, everything about birds is in some way connected to flight. It's a broad topic, but I'll share my screen. It has a slideshow and get going, and then I can take some questions at the end. So everyone should be seeing a Jamaican Toady, which is, the toadies are just such fantastic birds. There's 5 species in the Caribbean and nowhere else in the world. But like all birds, they fly, and flight, even though toadies probably never fly more than 50 feet at a time. They're very short distance flyers, but still flight is absolutely critical to everything that they do. They catch insects in flight. They use their wings for signaling with sound. Just like any other bird, so much of their anatomy, physiology, behavior is shaped by flight. Get my next slide ready. There we go. So this is a blue jay from the eastern US. It's a spectacular bird, but so common that we take it for granted. But again, flight is just part of everything that they do. And flight depends on feathers. And this is a dinosaur. And we know now that the birds are the direct descendants of dinosaurs. This dinosaur, called Anchiornis, lived about 160 million years ago. And at this time, there were a lot of dinosaurs with feathers like this one. And these were sort of loose, floppy feathers, kind of like an ostrich plume. And I'll explain the evolution of feathers in a minute, but this dinosaur had these feathers all over its body, and this one, the the fossil of this dinosaur was so well preserved that the researchers were able to look at the fossil under an electron microscope and see the pigment granules in the feathers. So they could reconstruct the kind of pigment and where it was in the feathers. So this painting that I did is my own rough reconstruction of what this dinosaur might have looked like, the real color pattern. Gray, black, and white pattern on the limbs, the tail, and a more reddish rust color on the crest. So there were a lot of birds. Birds were evolving at about the same time as this dinosaur. Archaeopteryx appeared about the same time, the first true bird. And then in the next 100 million years, birds evolved into all kinds of diverse forms, and they all went extinct in the asteroid impact and in what is now the Yucatan about 65 million years ago. All the dinosaurs were wiped out. All but 3 species of birds were wiped out by that asteroid impact. And the birds that we see today, 65 million years later, are all descended from those 3 species that survived the asteroid impact. One was the ancestor of the ostrich, emu, kiwi group. One was the ancestor of the ducks and chickens group, and one the ancestor of everything else. And feathers are the only birds have feathers, and feathers are really kind of define birds. Feathers are important for flight, but feathers serve lots of other functions as well. And the feathers first appeared in dinosaurs probably for insulation and camouflage. It's hard to say which came first, or if there even was a first. One was more important than the other, but feathers then evolved into all kinds of different forms. This is a house sparrow showing the arrangement of feathers on the bird. Lots of different shapes. Every feather on a bird's body is specialized for that location. Feathers are all different shapes, sizes, stiffness, texture. All of those things change at different parts of a bird's body. And one of the really critical things for flight, besides providing the surface for the wing to provide lift, feathers also streamline the body. So the smooth torpedo-like shape of a bird's body is formed by feathers. And that's a really important aspect of allowing them to fly efficiently. And here's another example, this common raven with feathers, all the different modifications of feathers from all different parts of the head. There's bristle-like feathers that cover the nostrils, little tiny stiff feathers that grow out of the forehead and around in front of the eye, longer feathers on the back of the head. And this one on the far left, that feather would cover the ear opening, which is below and behind the eye on the side of the head. That's where the ear is. And birds have evolved these specialized feathers to grow across the ear opening to protect the ear and allow sound to pass through. So these feathers have a more open structure on the part that lays across the ear opening. But when many of these feathers overlap over the ear opening, it forms a mesh that protects the ear from any foreign objects, but also allows sound through. And in terms of flight, one of the things that these feathers are really important for, again, it's streamlining. If you think of riding a bicycle at 20 miles an hour, or sticking your head out of a car window at 25, 30 miles an hour, and those are typical flight speeds for birds. We can't hear because the wind in our ears is so loud at that speed, but birds are traveling that speed all the time. And the amount of noise that the turbulence creates in our ears can actually damage our hearing over time. a few hours of exposure can damage your hearing slightly. And so birds have these feathers that cover the ear opening for streamlining, so that as they travel through the air flows smoothly across their ear, and presumably they can hear perfectly everything that's happening around them, even though they're traveling 25 miles an hour through the air. Now this is a sort of timeline of the evolution of feathers, starting on the left with the precursor of the modern feather was just a bristle, a hollow bristle. And dinosaurs had that. And some birds, like the raven, the bristles that cover the nostrils of a raven are probably similar to the very first feathers. So a hollow bristle would have been useful for insulation and for color, could be colored for camouflage or for display. The next stage is this downy sort of feather where the fibers that make up that hollow bristle just separate into separate strands and form this loose, downy, sort of fuzzy structure. And that was probably even more effective for insulation. And again, could have been colored for camouflage or for display. The next stage is a branching structure in the middle. The feather has a central shaft and barbs extending out on either side from that central shaft. This is the kind of feather that Onchiornis had. It's similar to a modern ostrich plume. And not stiff enough, not sturdy enough to support flight. That comes after the next stage here, where there's another level of branching. So there's the central shaft of the feather, and off the side of the shaft, barbs on both sides, and off of each barb, front and back, little tiny hooks that grab onto the barb next to it, so that the barbs then lock together to form a more solid surface that resists air pressure. So it doesn't, when you wave one of these feathers through the air, it doesn't just flop around like an ostrich plume does. It actually holds its stiff, flat surface and can push air around. That's the adaptation that made flight possible. And then the far right is the last stage in the evolution of feathers. The most specialized feathers that we have are the big feathers of the wings, the flight feathers. These are, the specialization is all in the details. It's all subtle, but the leading edge is narrower than the trailing edge. The barbs on the leading edge come out at a different angle. They have a different shape. The tip of the feather is shaped differently. There's sort of notches and narrower parts. Very, very specialized. And this is showing even more detail that engineers have looked at the feather for the micro engineering of the feather. So the shaft of one of these feathers is a foam-filled tube, which is the strongest, the most efficient structure, the most strength for weight. So you can make a very light structure that's also very strong. And birds evolved that structure, the foam-filled tube, and the layers of the tube are fibers oriented in different directions, just like modern carbon fiber tubes, the really high-tech, lightweight, strong tubes that are being manufactured now. It's all just like feathers. And as you go out along the length of the feather, the shape of that tube, the shape of the shaft changes, which gives the feather different properties of stiffness and strength at different points along its length. And at the far right, this is a cross-section of one of the barbs, which is oval, a vertical oval, and that gives it a lot of resistance to bending up or down, but a lot of flexibility side to side. So if a bird's feather bumps into something, if it's flying along and it hits a twig, say, the barbs will twist and then bend in the sideways direction, and then snap back into their normal position undamaged. So they separate from the barbs next to them, the hooks release, and then they twist and bend, and the bird continues flying, no damage, no harm. It's just an incredible, the microengineering of the feathers is so detailed and so exquisitely tuned for flight. Another aspect of feathers, this was something that I learned as I was working on my new book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, that feathers are waterproof because of their structure. It's the spacing of the barbs that prevents water from sticking to the feather or flowing through. So this detail on the right here is a cross section of the barbs from part of the feather, that upright oval shape, and a drop of water suspended on top of the barbs. So the water holds together because of its surface tension. And because of the spacing of the barbs, the water only makes contact across the ridges of a few barbs. So it's just making contact with a little bit of the surface of the feather, and then gravity or movement is enough to shake off that drop of water, and it just rolls off like water off a duck's back. And this, again, is particularly important for flight because the amount of work that's required for flight is directly proportional to the weight of the bird that is flying. So the less weight a bird is carrying, the more efficient its flight will be, the easier it will fly. So if its feathers get wet, that's a lot of extra weight that it doesn't want to be carrying. And this waterproofing of the feathers and water resistance, water repellency built into the feathers is critical for making flight possible and very efficient. And these are double-crested cormorants, which you might have heard that cormorants don't have oil in their feathers. That's not true. They do have oil that they preen into their feathers. But the oil is not what makes the feathers waterproof. It's the structure. And apparently cormorant feathers have, the barbs are held together by barbules, the little hooks in the center of the feather, but the margins of the feather, the barbs are loose and flexible and can stick together. They can, water can soak the margins of the feathers. So cormorants can swim in the water for a little while, about 20 minutes, I think, and then their feathers are soaked and they have to get out. They're still waterproof. Water doesn't reach their skin, but they're carrying a lot of extra weight when they get out. So they spend a lot of time after they get out of the water, standing on pilings, on rocks, or even just sitting on the surface of the water, swimming and holding their wings up to dry in the air so that they don't have to carry all that excess weight of water when they fly. Now, feathers also wear out. And this is an example of these gull feathers from the wingtip of a ring-billed gull. And this example shows that the black pigment, the melanin pigment that forms the black markings in the wingtips actually makes the feather stronger and more resistant to wear. So if you find an old gull feather on the beach, one of these feathers from the outer wing, it's most likely a feather that was worn for one full year and then molted, and it will look like the image on the bottom. here, the example on the bottom, that's very worn, and the white parts have worn away more quickly, more completely than the black parts. And this is one reason that so many birds have dark wingtips. The tips of the wing feathers are black to give them extra strength, extra resistance to fading and abrasion and wear and tear, so that the wing, it helps to keep the rest of the wing intact, because it has to last one full year. These birds molt their feathers only once a year. Here's an example of a scarlet tanager that's molting this species. Molts its body feathers twice a year to change from red to olive colored plumage and back to red. But its wing feathers only molt once each year. This is a tail feather from a red-winged blackbird, but well, I say red-winged blackbird, it could be any, almost any blackbird. It's an all-black feather, but if you look closely, you can see faint bands across it, faint dark and light bars, and those are growth bars, like the rings in a tree, except each one of these pairs of light and dark bands indicates a 24-hour period of growth. And I always forget which. I think it's dark bands grow in the daytime and lighter bands grow at night, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, it's one pair of dark and light bands represent 24 hours of growth of this feather. So this feather took about 3 weeks to grow. And all birds grow feathers at about the same rate, just a few millimeters a day in one 24-hour period. So a small bird like a toady can molt, say, one of its body feathers that's only maybe 10 millimeters long. That could grow in just a few days. One of its tail feathers, maybe 5 days. This red-winged blackbird takes 20 days to grow a tail feather. And a big bird like a pelican, those long wing feathers on a pelican, they still only grow a few millimeters a day. So those feathers, those long feathers, can take 3 months to grow. And how does the bird keep flying? This is a chimney swift, which migrates from the eastern US into Amazonia for the winter. And there's a possibility that they spend the entire winter in the air. They might not land from the time they leave their chimneys in the eastern US in the fall, and between then and when they come back in the spring, it's possible that they spend that entire time, 6 or 7 months, in the air. That's been documented for a couple of other species of swifts recently, including, I know, a black swift, which is found on a few of the Caribbean islands, and winters in also in Amazonia. It was recently documented that they spend the entire winter flying. Well, it's inferred. They put some tracking devices on the swifts, and they moved continuously. They never stopped moving. So the assumption is that they spend the entire winter flying. So a bird like this, it has to molt, but it has to keep flying. And birds do that by molting their wing feathers gradually. They begin with typically they begin with the innermost wing feathers, or the big feathers that grow from the hand bones. So the outer part of the wing, it's called the primaries, the biggest wing feathers on this outer part of the wing. And they typically begin with molting the innermost feathers there. One feather falls out, a new one begins growing in its place, and once that new feather has grown a little ways out, the next feather drops. And once the first feather is completely grown and the second feather is partially grown, then the third feather drops. So they move through the wing gradually. And it might take, in this case, months, 2 or 3 months for a chimney swift to molt all of its wing feathers. They're not very big, but doing it gradually like this takes a long time. And going back to a big bird like a brown pelican, where one individual feather could take 3 months to grow, they molt in a gradual process that takes maybe 3 years to go through their entire set of wing feathers, which means that one of those wing feathers on a brown pelican has to last 3 years of wear and tear, exposure to the sun and salt, and being used every single day for flying. It's just really remarkable that a feather, it's so light and at the same time so durable that one feather on a brown pelican can be used daily for 3 years before it's replaced. Now, as I said, bird or any flight is more efficient if you're carrying less weight. So birds have a very lightweight skeleton, but well, that's what I've always heard. It turns out that bird skeletons are not particularly lightweight by themselves. A bird's skeleton is about the same proportion of its body weight as the skeleton of a mammal of the same size. So the skeleton of a mouse is the same proportion of its body weight as the skeleton of a small bird. But birds' bones are hollow, which makes them stronger and stiffer. A tube is a stronger, stiffer structure than a solid stick. Bird bone tissue is denser than mammals' bone tissue, so that's actually, the tissue itself is heavier, but also stronger and stiffer. So those adaptations allow birds to have these very long, slender bones, and to create this very extended, elongated skeleton without any added weight. So birds don't have a particularly light skeleton. What they have is a very long and stiff and strong skeleton without any extra weight. Now, this is something I just recently learned. One of the adaptations that makes the wing structure of a modern bird possible is a very sharp bend in the wrist joint here, where a wing folds, and it would, I've indicated the angles of the bones here in orange, it can actually fold even tighter than this. So typically the wrist joint, our wrist joint, bends to about 90 degrees, which we wouldn't be able to fold our wings, fold our arms up along the sides of our body the way a bird can fold its wings. And apparently this adaptation, this hyper-flexible wrist joint, has been traced back to some dinosaurs. That's one of the adaptations that makes flight, well, it makes the folding, the putting away of the bird's wing possible, because they can bend that wrist joint very sharply to fold the wing up tightly against the side of the body. And it's the bones that make the, well, bones and feathers make the different wing structures that we see in birds. So this is a ring-billed gull on the left and a chimney swift on the right. And I've painted the arm bones in blue and the hand bones in red. You can see the difference in structure created by the different lengths of the bones, and then the lengths of the feathers that form the surface of the wing. So the wing itself is based on the arm bones similar to what we have, arm and hand, but greatly modified in different species. Another adaptation that makes flight possible is the consolidation of all of the bird's mass into a compact central body that is suspended below the wings. So all of the flesh and bones of the bird, almost all of it, is in a very compact body. The wings themselves are almost entirely feathers. There are just bones and tendons and some very slender muscles that extend out along the wing bones. The wing surface is almost entirely feathers. The tail is entirely feathers. The legs are, again, bones and tendons with a leathery covering. All of the muscles that control those, the strong muscles that power the wings, the muscles for the legs, those are all incorporated into that central body mass and all suspended below the wings. And the head is lightweight, the neck is very slender. The bill is a very lightweight structure. All of that makes the body balanced for flight. And it's one of the things that makes flight possible and very efficient. So even if we had wings, we would have to have very large wings to be able to fly like a bird. And even if we had wings the right size to enable flight, we would still be very inefficient, ungainly, because our weight, the weight of our body, is spread out all over. Legs, arms, head, feet, we've got weight stretching out in all directions, unlike a bird, which is so compact. And this surf scoter, this is a northern duck, but all birds process food in the same way. This surf scoter is about to swallow a clam. They dive down in the ocean, find clams, and they come to the surface with a clam, and instead of cracking it open or chewing it, which they can't do because they don't have any teeth, they just swallow it. They swallow it whole. It goes into their stomach, which is inside that central body mass, and immediately they're able to fly. They're balanced. They can take off and fly. They've got a little extra weight to carry, but there's no processing time. There's no carrying of food in a place that would be off balance. So the clam or any kind of food gets crushed by the really powerful stomach muscles. Turkeys can crush whole walnuts, which I guess is no more impressive than a surf scoter crushing a whole clam in its stomach. And then the fragments of clamshell act like teeth in this case and help to grind up the edible parts. So as the stomach squeezes and massages the things the surf scoter has swallowed, it all gets chewed inside the stomach. While the surf scoter's head and bill are very lightweight, and all the food is held and processed inside that balanced body mass. So birds have evolved so many different flight styles, ways of flying, uses for flight. Birds like this common loon, their wings are relatively small. They have to run to get up enough speed to take off from the water, and they flap continuously while they're flying. The common city pigeon is a very efficient, very powerful flyer, but they also flap continuously. They almost never glide. They're flapping all the time, but they can maintain speeds of 40, 50 miles per hour. Birds like this winter wren, which is similar to a toady in overall shape, they only fly very short distances, usually low from bush to bush. They have short rounded wings and a rounded tail and flap in quick bursts as they go, folding their wings up against the sides of the body. In the case of the winter wren, even though they live most of their life just flying very short distances low through the brush, then in the spring and fall they take off, and some of them migrate 2,000 miles from central Canada to Texas or Florida. So I imagine a toady is probably capable of similar long flights. They just never need to. I mean, the winter wren doesn't fly 2,000 miles at a stretch. It's flying a 100 or a few hundred miles in a night. And of course, they've evolved a lot of adaptations to store fuel for that flight. But still, birds are capable of some incredible things that you'd never imagine that a winter wren could take off and fly 200 or 300 miles in a night, but they do. The barn swallow is an incredibly efficient flyer and migrates from some from northern Canada all the way to southern South America, thousands of miles. And they do it just by, well, they spend their whole life flying almost continuously, just flying for many, many hours every day, catching insects in the air with a very efficient shape, with the pointed wings and a long forked tail that makes them extremely efficient at flying. The turkey vulture is a really widespread bird that is, again, it's a very efficient flyer. It requires almost no energy to stay aloft, but has a completely different strategy from the barn swallow. The swallow has a super efficient wing shape and flaps a lot. The turkey vulture almost, well, they flap as little as they can manage, and they have a big surface area of wing relative to their body weight, so they can catch updrafts and rising warm air and thermals, and catch whatever lift they can from the air currents and just glide around without flapping. The slots in their wingtips and their dihedral wing shape with the wings angled up are both adaptations that allow them to fly at slow speed in uneven air currents and still be stable and smooth and able to maneuver. So they are really amazingly efficient flyers as well, but a completely different style of flight. And maybe the pinnacle of avian flight, at least the fastest, is the peregrine falcon, which has been clocked at speeds of 240 miles per hour, but probably goes a lot faster. Theoretically, could go well over 300 miles per hour. When they get into this shape, gravity assisted, going straight down, and just incredibly streamlined, adapted to achieve that kind of speed. It's hard to imagine going that fast. But at the same time, when a peregrine falcon is migrating and traveling long distances and wants to conserve energy, it can soar just like a turkey vulture, taking advantage of rising air currents from warm, where the sun warms the ground, the air rises from that warm ground, and birds will circle in that rising warm air. And peregrine falcons do that as well as any other soaring bird. Another trick that birds use to increase their efficiency in flight is the flying in V formation, like geese, cormorants, pelicans often fly in lines. Ibises fly in lines. So you'll see this often, birds flying in lines or V's, but they're always offset a little bit, usually not in a straight line, one behind the other. And the reason is this: the bird in front on the right, this Canada goose, it leaves behind a wash of air moving down, a downwash, through most of its body and wings are pushing air down. So it leaves a eddies of air moving down, except at the tips of its wings, it leaves a vortex where the air is pushed down by the tip of the wing, but then swirls back up off around the tip of the wing. So the bird that's following behind, if it positions itself just right to follow the trail of the bird in front, it can put one wing into that rising air current where the air is swirling up around the wingtip of the bird in front. And that's apparently what they're doing as they fly in these lines with each bird offset a little bit, just putting one wingtip into the rising air current left by the bird in front. It speaks to an incredible sensitivity to air movement, being able to feel, to sense when they're getting a little bit of lift, and they can increase their efficiency by a significant amount just by taking advantage of that extra lift. Now, wings have also evolved for other things. This thick-billed murre is a northern Arctic seabird, and it's sort of convergent evolution with puffins from the southern hemisphere, penguins from the southern hemisphere. Puffin is related to this thick-billed murre, but penguins are only found in the southern oceans, and they're similar to these murres and puffins in many ways, but not related. But the murres and puffins use their wings underwater and essentially fly underwater using their wings as flippers, and they're able to swim long distances and very deep into the ocean just using their wings. Hummingbirds, of course, have evolved hovering flight, the only birds that truly hover, getting lift from upstroke and downstroke. Kingfishers and other species like osprey and kestrel hover. Well, we say they hover, they don't truly hover. They're only getting lift from the downstroke, so they're flying in place. And if you watch very carefully, when you see a kingfisher or a kestrel holding its position in the sky, you'll see that they keep their head perfectly still, locked at one point in space, while the body is bouncing around as the wings flap and the tail flares, trying to hold their position as they flap. So, and birds, right now, this is a white-crowned sparrow, but lots of songbirds now are migrating incredible distances. They're just reaching Massachusetts, New York now, where I am. But they've probably passed through the Caribbean a few weeks ago. The warblers, vireos, thrushes, and they're migrating mostly at night. So spending all day foraging, resting, keeping their feathers in good condition, getting water, and then taking off after sunset to fly 6 or 8 hours, traveling a few hundred miles, making their way north. Flight makes all that possible. Birds like this black phoebe, but all the flycatchers, and including aerial insectivores like toadies, they'll catch insects in flight in midair. Imagine tracking the movement of a mosquito as it flies through the air. And high-speed video has shown that these birds are not just flying quickly at the insect and sort of scooping it up in their bill. They're actually snapping it out of the air with the tips of their mandibles. So imagine flying through the air, tracking the movement of a mosquito, and then grabbing it out of the air with a pair of tweezers. That's essentially what these small flycatchers are doing. Mockingbirds use their wings and the white patches in their wings to scare insects out of hiding. So they're taking advantage of the big surface area of their wings and the big white flash to startle insects and try to make the insect flinch and reveal its position. so that they can grab it. Birds like this bobolink that are migrating north right now, they sing in flight. Wilson snipe uses modified tail feathers to make a sound, so they're using flight as part of their display. Red-tailed hawks, they're probably pretty much done displaying now, but the male and female have a courtship display in flight. The male flies just above the female with legs dangling, and they circle together, often calling, and many species have flight displays that they use in courtship or at other times. Flight is such an integral part of a bird's life. And finally, I'll just close with one of the questions that I came up with and tried to answer in What It's Like to Be a Bird is, are birds afraid of heights? And it turns out the answer is probably yes, that young birds, before they're able to fly, have an instinctive fear of heights. But once a bird grows its wing feathers and becomes comfortable using its wings and flying, they have no fear. They know that this tanager can perch on a twig at the top of the tallest tree and fly out to grab a passing insect or fly to the next twig with no fear of falling, because it can just spread its wings and move on to the next perch. It's kind of magical to think about life as a bird, being able to just move through the treetops, move through the sky effortlessly and with no fear. So that is my discussion of bird flight, and hope I've given you some perspective on what it's like to be a bird flying, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Wow, excellent. Thank you so much, David. That was incredible. I learned so many interesting,
Thanks.
fascinating facts about birds, and then to have them so beautifully illustrated with your drawings, and you know, it was really awesome. So yes, we do have some questions. Let me just find them for you, and I can pose them to you. And again, everybody, if you have any questions for David, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them as quickly as we can. So let's see. If a bird loses a wing feather while not molting, will it grow another one?
Yes, they do. They do replace feathers in between molting periods. And one of the interesting things, if it's a bird that changes plumage from season to season, like a tanager, the hormones control the color of the feather. So feathers, in a bird like that, the feather will grow from the same follicle in the skin twice a year and have a different color depending on which hormones are in the body at that time. So you could see, say, a summer tanager that has completely, a male summer tanager will be all red. Well, they're actually red year round, but they have those hormones during the period when they're molting the feathers. And if they replace a feather at an odd time, the hormones then will produce a yellow olive feather. So sometimes you can tell when a bird has lost a feather and replaced it because it doesn't quite match the other feathers. But yes, they will grow a replacement if they lose feathers anytime.
Okay, excellent. Somebody asked, do swifts sleep in the air? All these birds that are migrating in flight for 24 hours a day.
Yeah, presumably swifts sleep while they're flying if they're spending 6 months in the air. There was research on frigate birds, which are a lot bigger than swifts, so they can carry, all this research is done with putting transmitters on the birds and tracking devices, and frigate birds are able to carry a device big enough so that the researchers could track where they went and also track their brain waves, so they knew when the frigate birds were sleeping. So this research was done in the Indian Ocean with great frigate birds, but I bet it's the same in the Caribbean. The frigate birds there, and many of the frigate birds were spending days at a time in flight and sleeping in flight. And birds have the ability to sleep with just half of their brain. They can put half of their brain to sleep and still function with the other half. But they found that these frigate birds were actually some small percentage of the time when they were asleep was both sides of their brain asleep. So fully asleep. And they would climb way up high, go very high over the ocean, and then rest and just sort of circle on autopilot, I guess, thousands of feet up over the ocean, and sometimes fall completely asleep. But I should say, with the birds like the songbirds that are migrating at night, there's still a lot of questions about that. They don't sleep, or presumably don't sleep while they're flying. But so this time of year, while they're migrating, they're spending all day getting ready for their flight and all night flying. And they're only getting maybe a total of 2 hours of sleep every 24 hours in short naps. Once they start nesting, they switch to a more typical day-night cycle. They sleep when it's dark and they're awake when it's light. And then when the next migration season starts, they go back to this total of 2 hours of cat naps or bird naps every 24 hours. So that research was fairly new a few years ago. And one of the big questions is, how do they function? Going 6 or 8 weeks of almost no extended sleep, just these short naps. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot still to learn about birds and sleep, but they do some amazing things.
Incredible. All right, another question. What happened with flightless birds? Were their bodies too heavy to fly?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of flightless birds live on islands where there aren't any predators, and they've lost the ability to fly. Birds, it's possible that that is a very interesting question. That I'm just thinking about it now. If you think about from the asteroid impact, the ancestral bird that gave rise to the now ostriches, cassowaries, kiwis, and tinamous, which are in Central and South America. The tinamous can fly, but none of those others can. And I wonder if the ancestor of all of those was flightless. That would mean that then flight evolved in tinamous independently from all of the other flying birds, which would be anyway, that's a very interesting question. But yes, most of the flightless birds we have today are, besides the potential of that group, it's flightless birds on isolated islands where they have no need to fly, and they have simply lost the ability to fly.
Yeah. And then they get in trouble when invasive ground predators are introduced, because they can't escape.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, many of them are extinct now.
Yeah, sadly. All right, and somebody is asking, this is kind of a related question, which theory for flight in birds do you lean towards, ground up or trees down?
Yeah, it's a big debate in flight, or sort of the evolution of flight, whether the question is, did flight evolve first as sort of a gliding mechanism where birds climbed trees and then spread their wings and could glide a long way or have a soft landing? Because flight had to begin as some sort of simple thing that then became much more complex and sophisticated, like a peregrine falcon. The peregrine falcon didn't just spring up suddenly So there's the trees down gliding theory, and then there's the ground up where birds developed wings that were useful for in some way for moving along the ground. I think I guess I don't think they're all that separate. And there was some research by Ken Dial at Montana, who's done a lot of research on that. He proposed that one of the ways that birds use rudimentary wings, and he was looking at like baby quail, baby chickens, with very small wings that they can't really fly, but they still use their wings. And one of the ways they use them is running. When they're running up a steep incline, they flap their little tiny wings, and it helps them get up a steep incline. Or if they're running at high speed and trying to change direction quickly, they put out their wings and flap a little bit to help change direction. And that's part of that would fit with the ground up theory. But at the same time, if they're running along the ground and they get to a drop off, a little cliff or a stream they need to cross or something, they could gliding would be very helpful then also. So I think the two, I guess I'm in the ground up camp if they're separate at all.
Okay, great. All right, and somebody asks, is the feather structure of the cormorant what enables it to dive under the water?
Yeah, that's one of the questions, that they have this interesting feather structure, and it seems like it's a real disadvantage in terms of flying because they get wet and then they have to dry off before they can fly efficiently. So it must give them some other advantage, and the speculation is that it helps them in some way to swim, either reducing their buoyancy so they can dive down more easily and stay underwater more easily, or it might also produce less friction, reduce friction on the surface of their feathers. If the feathers are holding onto water, it might allow them to move through the water more efficiently, like those fancy suits that swimmers started wearing a few years ago that got banned from competition because they were too smooth, yeah, too frictionless. And there's research has shown that the great cormorant is a North Atlantic species, but it probably fits for all cormorants. They are the most efficient marine predator that has been measured. They catch more prey per unit time than any other marine predator known. So they're doing something right, whatever it is. So yeah, it's still an open question exactly what the advantage is of having those kinds of feathers that get wet, but there must be some advantage.
Okay. All right. Yeah, still sticking on the subject of cormorants, is the frigate bird feather structure similar to cormorants then?
Oh, that's a good question, but frigate birds they never make contact with the water. They don't swim.
That's right.
They catch prey by swooping down to the surface and grabbing things, only touching the water with their bill. Mm-hmm. I would imagine that they have a more typical sort of land bird feather structure that's just, it turns out that the spacing of the barbs in the feathers is a compromise between water repellency, so that drops of water just roll off, and waterproofing to prevent water from going through. So barbs spaced more widely mean that the drop of water is contacting fewer of the barbs and rolls off more easily, but that leaves bigger gaps, so water under pressure that something like a diving duck would experience can get through that. So you can actually measure the spacing of the barbs on a feather and know what kind of bird it was. If it's a bird that dives underwater, it has barbs spaced closer together. If it's a bird that lives on land and rarely contacts water, the barbs are spaced farther apart. So I suspect the frigate bird would have a land bird feather structure, since they just never have much contact with water other than rain.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, and somebody from Facebook asks, do feathers grow at the same pace no matter what the species?
Yeah, apparently. Roughly three to 5 millimeters a day is what I've read, and all feathers grow at the same rate, whether it's an eagle or a hummingbird. And I don't know how many different species that's been measured for, or how many different feathers. So I don't know how much of that is speculation, or how much is actually known. But yeah, that's what I've read, that feathers just grow at a constant rate no matter the bird.
That's fascinating. Yeah, so that's why a big bird like the pelican, it takes 3 months for the feathers.
Yeah. So it's I mean, the structure of the feather is the same. The spacing of the barbs, the number of barbules, all of that is the same, no matter how long it is. A pelican's feather or an eagle's feather is much wider than a small bird's feather. So, but then they would have probably a larger feather follicle. Anyway, it's that's what I've heard, is that they all grow at the same rate.
Okay, amazing. All right, and Jane from the Cayman Islands is asking, people always ask me how long it takes for a primary wing feather of a parrot to regrow. So I guess calculate it.
Yeah, it should be a few millimeters a day, and it's probably, I would guess, it's probably just a little bit longer than the tail feather of a red-winged blackbird, or maybe even a similar length. So so 3 weeks, 4 weeks would be my guess, something in that range, for the feather to grow completely.
Excellent. All right, and Ann Maddock is commenting, hi David, fascinating presentation. 2 years ago, while photographing hummingbirds on Grand Bahama at a bromeliad flower spike, I also photographed a black-throated blue warbler using a bromeliad stalk to feed from. It appeared to be hovering as it grabbed the sap, but what should I look for in my photos to see if it was upstroke or downstroke rather than true hovering?
Well, you can be sure that it was not true hovering. It's it would be getting all of its lift from the downstroke, and the way hummingbirds' wings work, when they're on the downstroke, they're angled like this, so moving forward, and air is being pushed down as the angled wing moves forward. And you can imagine like being in a swimming pool and moving your hands side to side. So moving in one direction, you push water down that way. You flip your hand and move it back the other way to push water down. And you just keep doing figure eights like this. And that's what the hummingbird's wings are doing. So it's getting lift on both upstroke and downstroke. And the other birds can't do that. Their wings simply don't work that way. So they can flap down, and then on the upstroke, they're more like a swimmer doing a butterfly stroke. We keep talking about swimming, but where the wings are pulled in close to the body and lifted up, and then spread out and swept forward and down to push air, and then pulled in close to the body, raised up close, and pushed out again. That's how most birds flap, with that kind of in and out motion. So the upstroke, they're just trying to get as little resistance as possible on the upstroke, and all the lift comes from the downstroke. So, but you can probably, if you have really high-speed video or stop action photos of the black-throated blue warbler hovering, you can probably see some of that action going on and confirm that.
Excellent. Okay, and then Ann Sutton from Jamaica is asking, is it true that toady feathers have a unique structure?
A good question. I haven't heard that, but I haven't done much research on toadies. They don't occur in the US, so I have seen them and marveled at them, but I haven't read much about them. They're, I know that like hummingbirds, there is no green pigment in American birds. The only birds in the world with green pigment are the turacos in Africa. So the green color of a toady is all, it's a lot of it or all of it is, it's called structural color, where the structure of the surface of the feather interacts with the light waves to produce the green color that we see. Instead of molecules of pigment that are absorbing some wavelengths and reflecting others, it's the structure, the really microscopic structure of the surface of the feather that interacts with the light waves to interfere with some and cancel them out and amplify others. That's the way iridescence works. It's why hummingbirds have such incredibly pure and vibrant colors, because they have a really refined structural color structures in their feathers that produce these incredibly intense, sort of purified colors of one wavelength. And so anyway, the green color on toadies is a result of the structure of the surface of the feather. I would imagine that the feather itself, the barbs and everything else, is probably similar to all other birds, but then the microscopic structure of the surfaces of those larger features would produce that color. So that might be what's being referred to.
Okay, excellent. All right, another question. Please talk about a bird's ability to land on very thin branches. Seems to us like a very difficult task, but they seem to do it so easily.
Yeah, so that brings up a couple of things. Birds with most birds have their eyes on the sides of their head. So they have good vision out to the sides, and many species 360 degrees around. They can see their entire surroundings all at once, but they don't have particularly good vision straight ahead. Many species can't see the tip of their bill, and they'll have a small area of binocular vision where both eyes are seeing the same thing straight ahead, but not a lot of detail there. So that's what they're using to judge the distance of a perch that's approaching. But it makes their landing on these tiny perches even more remarkable to think that that's not their sharpest vision. But they do have overlapping vision there, so they can determine the distance to a perch, and that's primarily what they use their forward vision for. Apparently, is just finding that distance. But once they've located, they've seen a perch, locked onto it, determined the distance. I think it's pretty automatic. Then they go, well, I shouldn't say automatic. You'll see young birds. It's one of the things that young birds really struggle with when they're first beginning to fly, is judging the wind currents and finding their way to a perch and actually getting their feet on the perch. Once they get their feet on the perch, then they can kind of balance there. But that's another aspect of that is the balancing on the perch, and that finding the perch, getting themselves to it through the air, and then landing on it and balancing there depends on them having, so they have a balance sensor in their inner ear like we do, and birds apparently have a second balance sensor in their pelvis. So they can track the movement of their body. We get all of our balance from our head, from our inner ear. So but birds can track the movement of their body separately from their head, and I think that's how, birds like ibises, you'll see an ibis perched on a twig on one leg at the same time it's spinning its head around, preening or looking in different directions. And you try standing on one leg and swinging your head around to look at different things, you'll lose your balance, because you're messing up your balance sensor by swinging your head around. But the birds have a separate balance sensor in their pelvis. And I think it's critical. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it, that they can do things like that, balance on a perch. What birds like the kestrel or a kingfisher are doing when they're hovering in the air, they're keeping their head absolutely still while their body bounces around. That probably also depends on having two separate balance motion sensors. So yeah, I guess there's a lot that goes into flying up to a perch and landing on it. Yeah. And it is something that young birds really have to get some experience with before they become really expert at it.
Right, excellent. Birds are amazing, that's for sure. So a couple more questions and then we should probably wrap up. Do Arctic terns have a similar molt to swifts, as they also have habits of continuous movement and migration?
Yeah, yes, they do. They molt their feathers gradually, and quite gradually. And the terns also, they have a strategy of their molt can be interrupted. So if they're on the wintering grounds and their molt requires a lot of energy, so it's costly. So it usually doesn't overlap with migration or nesting or these other kind of costly things that birds do. So if a tern is molting on the wintering grounds when it's not otherwise occupied with nesting or migrating, it has plenty of food, it's comfortable, and it's a good time to molt. But if migration time comes and it hasn't finished its molt, it will just pause and finish growing the feather that's growing, but not drop the next one, and then make the migration with maybe 4 new feathers and 6 old ones. And once it gets to the breeding grounds, after the young, once the young start growing and it's got a little energy to spare, it will start molting again. Fall migration, it pauses again. So they have that kind of the ability to start and stop their molt when they need to.
Amazing. All right. Maria asks, birds in a murmuration, do they use that wingtip airflow to not bump into each other?
No, that's well, they might be doing some of
what a murmuration is.
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, murmuration is a term that's used specifically for flocks of starlings. These gigantic flocks of starlings that are seen mostly in Europe at a big roost, thousands and thousands of birds, and they fly in very tight formation. Well, not formation, just in a ball. They form these amorphous sort of, like a lava lamp, these weird shapes that bulge out and separate and come back together and swirl around. Usually when there's a predator there, like a hawk that's chasing them, they form a very tight flock, and these weird amorphous blobs moving around in the sky. So that's called a murmuration. So the birds are flying in a very tight flock, but they're not really in a formation. So they probably are. I imagine that they're sensing the airflow of the wake of the bird in front of them, and they may be taking advantage of that a little bit. They might be able to kind of move around using the wake, the flow left by the bird in front, but mostly they're just shorebird sandpipers do a similar thing where a flock will turn almost in unison and form a tight ball when they're trying to avoid a predator, form a very tight ball and make these quick changes of direction. And so the research on that has shown that it's simply birds reacting to their neighbors in the flock. And birds on the edges of the flock are always trying to get into the center. So that's what initiates a turn, is if a few birds at the edge turn into the flock, and then their neighbors start to turn, and their neighbors start to turn, and pretty soon the whole flock has changed direction and changed shape, and they turn. It's sort of like the way a marching band turns on a playing field. So it ends up with the birds that turned initially end up in the middle of the flock. They're not on the edge anymore. So, and then it's just a constant kind of competition to see who can get to the center of the flock. And a lot of the turns are probably initiated by real true alarm, like there's a predator over there, we have to turn this way to get away from it. A lot of it is just birds that are nervous because they're at the edge of the flock and would prefer to be in the center, so they try to get into the center, and that makes the whole flock turn.
Okay, excellent explanation. Very cool. All right, well, last two questions. I'm sure we could go on all night talking to David. There's just so many interesting things that we're learning. Okay, which bird dives the deepest?
Yeah, I think the one that's been documented the deepest is the thick-billed murre that I did the painting of, although penguins.
Penguin, I was thinking penguin.
I should look that up.
Uh-oh. Yikes, we just lost David. I hope he'll be back in a minute.
Researchers there was putting little depth recorders on thick-billed murres at the nesting colony, and then retrieving those devices and reading the depths that the murres went to, and the devices were ruined. They were supposedly could withstand depths of I don't remember now, 200 or 300 meters. They were all destroyed by pressure, which suggests that the murres were going deeper than 200 or 300 meters, which is just hard to believe. It's dark down there. Even on a bright sunny day, it's just dark, and incredibly intense pressure that destroyed these little devices but didn't hurt the murres. So nobody knows, as far as I know, nobody knows yet exactly how deep murres go. I don't think the study was redone with different devices. Yeah, a lot of birds dive down 200 feet or so, or a few birds. Loons, a lot of the diving ducks have been measured or caught in nets that were set at 200 feet. or so, 180 feet. But the murres definitely go deeper.
Excellent. All right, we better wrap this up. Final question from Kelsey in the Cayman Islands. How can we purchase signed copies of your book?
Well, I don't know about in the Cayman Islands. Here in the US, it's available in all bookstores and from online sellers. So my newest book is What It's Like to Be a Bird. And I imagine that if that a local bookstore should be able to order it, or you could find it online, but I don't know about how to get it to the Cayman Islands.
Okay, so yeah, for sure it's on Amazon and other websites, so you can look for it there. She did ask about signed copies.
Oh, signed copies.
Here's what I propose, that you come to our next conference in the Caribbean and you bring a couple of cases and everybody can get their copy there with you signing it. How does that sound?
Yes. All right.
All right. Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, for attending. Thank you so much, David. This was amazing. I learned so much, and we'll have to have you back for another topic another time, because this was so much fun and so fascinating. So thank you for all your time sharing with us. Thank you to everybody for attending. And do follow us on Birds Caribbean, social media, on our website, our newsletter, and so forth, so you can keep up to date with our announcements, Endemic Bird of the Day, and everything else that we have going on. And have a great evening, everybody. And thanks again for joining. We'll sign off for now. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.